December always fills me with creative juices. And I have so many ideas. And so yet again, for the second week in a row, I decided to make the exception prove the rule. Because as much as I'm committed to sharing ancient stories, I think that perhaps it's time for a more modern story. So today, I wanted to share with you a very special story. A story from my own childhood. I grew up in Poland in the 1970s, and the world was different back then. And it seems, and perhaps in my memories as a child, all the sights and sounds and smells are so vivid and amazing. But that world of the 1970s, when TV was just a small part of our existence and we interacted with our family at such a deep level, it was a whole different world. And this is the world that I wanted to tell you about today. So imagine this. It's 1977. A fine mist covers the land. My mom and I have suitcases packed with clothes and presents, each one of us carrying 4 or 5 big bags, as much as we can carry, really. We make our way down to the streetcar, down a hill, toward the streetcar. And then we take the streetcar all the way to Grandma's house. We have to switch streetcars in the middle, going through tunnels underneath big city streets just to get to the second connection. We were staying there for the weekend, for the whole Christmas. And in Poland, Christmas starts on the 24th and ends sometime around the 27th. We always stayed at Grandma's. It was never a question, should we stay at Grandma? Should we stay home? Should we go home tonight? That never came up. It was always fully expected that all of Grandma's children and their children stay over for the 2 or 3 days of Christmas. That's what it was like when I was a small girl. All of the people would arrive at Grandma's house sometime around the mid-afternoon on the 24th, or mid-morning. If it was me, I was the eager beaver. I was always there in the morning because I thought that watching Grandma prepare Christmas was just the most fascinating thing. So we would all arrive sometime throughout the 24th. And generally, the people in our family, well, there were quite a few people. There were 4 sisters and 2 brothers in my mom's family. And at different times, some of them were married. But in 77, there were 3 aunts plus my mother. So all 4 sisters in the same house, which was always loud. And then there were 2 uncles. And one of the sisters was married. And they had a couple children. And the children would all be treated as a group, as a team, so to speak. And the aunts were one team. So out of the 4 aunts that were present, they were all sort of one entity. And we called them the aunts. All aunts, all the children, we called them the aunts. If one aunt said something, that meant that it was the law, as if your own mom said it. Sometimes, in extreme cases, we could refer to the mom, to the actual mom, but for the most part, the aunts acted as a one cohesive unit. And the uncles sort of stayed out of the way, but they did have some very, very important tasks. Now, Grandma's house was always referred to as Grandma's house, even when Grandpa was still alive, it was still called Grandma's house. Grandma was this pivotal, powerful figure in the family, and everybody looks up to her and honors her. And on the 24th, everybody needed to be ready to arrive for work. The aunt's responsibility was to chop vegetables and arrange food on platters. Yes, that was their responsibility. And whatever grandma needed them to do, but not to have any ideas, because grandma was in charge of the feast. And a feast it was, because each Christmas Eve, we were very dedicated to the tradition of having 12 Christmas dishes. 12 savory dishes on the table during the Christmas Eve feast, followed by several cakes. The children were tasked with going to the store. And no, not the way you think, not the way we do it these days. We would go to the stores between 6 and 10 times in the course of one afternoon. And if I was by myself, I was just sent off to the store by myself. But when the other cousins arrived, we would separate the tasks. So one cousin would hold the list, the other cousin would hold the bags, the shopping bags, and the third cousin would carry the money. I, as the oldest, was always responsible for their safety and well-being and their behavior at all times. So I had to keep them in line. At the same time, I had to keep them entertained. And these trips to the store, they weren't like, oh, go buy apples. Sometimes it was, go to John's Bakery and find out if the rye bread has arrived. If it hasn't arrived, tell the lady to put one aside for you and that you will be back in an hour. And then we would go back home. In the meantime, Grandma would send us to the vegetable store for parsley or dill or something small, and then we would come back, then we would go back to the bakery, and so on and so forth, all afternoon long. I sometimes wondered if she did that just to keep us out of the way. My grandma was very traditional. She believed in honoring the fast. There's a very old Polish tradition that on the 24th, Christmas Eve, one fasts from morning till evening until the evening feast. The evening feast starts with the first star. And I remember my grandma telling me that only very small children and pregnant ladies were allowed to have a piece of bread and some water when she was young on the 24th. Otherwise, water and no food until the feast. And even though she said we should all obey this and we should all honor this, every time we made big eyes and said, oh, but Grandma, we're hungry, we would always get a morsel from the kitchen of whatever was happening at the very moment. Now the uncles, in my opinion, had the most difficult task. They were tasked with killing the Christmas carp. Oh, let me tell you about the Christmas carp. A carp is a fish. It's a very different fish in Europe as it is in North America. They don't taste at all the same. In Europe, it doesn't have much of a fish smell. It's a very good fish. And in my grandma's eyes, the Christmas carp was the crowning glory of her magical feast. And the Christmas carp is quite a tradition. Most Polish families have the Christmas carp tradition. I'm not sure how it is now, but in the 70s, the mother or the matriarch of the household would go out to the market about 2 or 3 days before Christmas Eve. And she would then go to the fishmonger who was ready with a selection of carp. She would select the one that she liked best from a bucket full of water or a big pail full of water. And then she would receive it in a bag still full of water. She would bring it home and release it into the fish tank or into the bathtub, making the bathtub a temporary fish tank. During the time that the carp lived in the bathtub, no one was allowed to have a bath. The sink was all you got. So for the 2 days before Christmas Eve, you either went dirty or found a neighbor that did not have a carp in their bathtub and showered there. But on Christmas afternoon, a couple hours before the feast, it was time to kill the carp. And this is where the uncles came in. Being very cognizant of how sensitive children may be, the uncles formed a committee, locked themselves in a bathroom, and killed the carp. They cleaned everything up and made it as if the murder had never happened before the next child was back. Most of the time, they did it while we were at the store. Grandma would prepare the fresh carp, pan frying it with some magical ingredients. But as soon as the carp was passed on, as soon as the carp was dealt with, everyone in the family would rush for the bathroom, and everyone in turn would take a shower and get ready and put out their best clothes, because in order to sit at Grandma's Christmas Eve table, you had to be as clean as humanly possible, and preferably wear brand new everything from underwear to socks. Everything had to be clean and, if possible, new. While we got ready and made sure we looked better, this is not Sunday best. This is 10 times better than Sunday best. As good as we possibly could, Grandpa would step in and magically decorate the table. My grandfather was an artist, and he did amazing things. He would arrange fantastic arrangements out of pine needles or pine branches with, I think once I remember there being a model ship in the centerpiece, but I might be wrong about that. Grandpa would also carve things out of butter. He would carve roses out of butter. He would carve daisies out of carrots and peas and put them on the potato salad. And even some less than appetizing sounding dishes like fish in jello were made beautiful by my grandfather's carved masterpieces floating just under the surface of the savory jello. I wasn't a fan of the dish, but I loved looking at his art. Everything would turn magic. So once we were all ready, we would go to the window and look for the first star, because only when the first star was out in the sky was the family allowed to sit down and celebrate Christmas. And usually, in coincidence with the first star, there would be a mysterious bell sound from somewhere in the house. I was sure my grandfather was the one who rang the bells. But soon after the bell sound, the door to the dining room would be blown open as if by a magical wind, and there in all its glory stood the big Christmas tree, and under it all these presents for the whole family. And as amazed as we were only allowed to look at it for a couple minutes. And then the difficult part came. Because as we sat down to the table, and we were not allowed to open one present until after everyone had finished eating. Now imagine there were 12 dishes on the table, and every one of the adults and children had to sample every single one of those dishes. And my grandfather would make a game out of this. He would pick the boniest part of the fish, and he would surgically remove the bones from it with his knife and fork, eating a shred of fish flesh at a time, making the experience last as long as possible. But eventually, he also was finished eating. And then all the children would run up to the Christmas tree and open their presents in a flurry and hand the presents out to the rest of the family. We also received a big soup plate, a deep soup plate full of candy and chocolates and foreign chocolates. My grandfather had some sisters who lived in other countries, and they would send all these exotic candy and chocolate, and grandma would divide it equally so that each one of her children and her grandchildren would receive a plate full of Christmas goodies, and each person got the same fair share. The children's plates were a little more full than the adult plates, but it was whatever grandma deemed as fair. And there was not an option of comparing your plate to other people's plates because grandma was the fairest of them all. And so our evening would conclude with some movie and a blur of a sugar rush. That is, until the Christmas Mass. Because at the Christmas Mass, the church manger would be revealed. Until the midnight on Christmas Eve, all the mangers and all the churches were covered with a burlap cloth, and no one could see. It was quite a competition. Every church trying to make the best manger possible. And then throughout the Christmas season, we would take trips out into the city, looking at each of the churches and trying to see as many of the beautiful mangers as possible. And after the solemn Christmas Mass, and us admiring all the manger and all the beautiful lights in the church, we would finally turn in and look forward Christmas morning for more celebration with family.